Welcome to episode 4 of Incredible Teams, the show that explores the tales behind the world's best teams, the tactics that got them there, and how you can use some of them to apply to your own. This is your host, Liam Hurd, and today we're diving into part 1 of the UCLA Bruins men's basketball team. This team won 10 NCAA championships in 12 years under legendary coach John Wooden, and there was just so many good stories I decided to split it up into 2. And this episode will cover up to the 5th championship, and next episode will cover the last 5. So today we're looking at the time period of 1964 to 69. So let's get into it. John Wooden was born on October 14th, 1910 in Hall, Indiana, but moved in 1918 to a farm near Centerton, Indiana without electricity, running water, or indoor plumbing. At that time, Centerton was a small rural township, population of 86, with a church and an elementary school surrounded by farmland. And these two buildings kind of give an early glimpse into two of the driving forces behind Wooden's life, faith and education. 8 miles away from Centerton was the small city of Martinsville, which had about 4,800 people in 1918. And this is where Wooden would play his high school basketball. He was raised well. Author Larry Bortstein, in his book UCLA's Fabulous Bruins, describes all the virtues of faith, sincerity, and simple hard work were ingrained into him, and he became a living testament to their simple wisdom. Wooden's family struggled to make ends meet and expected John and his 3 brothers to pitch in with the chores and farm work. John was responsible for milking the cows, feeding the chickens, and picking some fruit. Despite the hard upbringing on the farm, Wooden's father made sure to emphasize the importance of sports every single day. After the chores were done, the boys would run off to practice basketball in the barn, and their father also built a baseball diamond in one of their crop fields. Father Joshua Wooden would also read poetry to his sons before bedtime. And later in life, John would express some of his most important teachings through rhyme and poem. The senior Wooden was a terrific father figure for John, who would later say, "My father would not speak an unkind word of another person. In my opinion, he came as close to living the philosophy of the Golden Rule as any person I have ever known." John Wooden would talk late into his 90s about the lessons and maxims that his father taught him and his brothers during those years of his childhood. Many simple but profound sayings were ingrained into John and eventually passed on to the players who were educated under him. And I use the word educated there really specifically because Wooden did believe that that was what he was doing, educating his kids, as he called them, for life through basketball. One lesson that traveled down from Father Joshua to son John to the players of UCLA was Joshua's 2 sets of 3. The first set, never lie, never cheat, never steal, and the second, don't whine, don't complain, don't make excuses. Something that will become very clear today is the overwhelming amount of maxims, sayings, and advice that Wooden brought forth. It may feel like I am including quite a lot today, but there'll probably be more in the next episode, and I only include about maybe 5% of what was in the sources that I read. As John grew older, he began to focus on basketball and stopped practicing for baseball. Although Bortstein, who wrote his book about the Bruins in 1972, says, to this day, Wooden admits a sneaky preference for baseball. And actually, in college, he would play 1 season of baseball as well. During high school at nearby Martinsville High School, he led the team to the Indiana State Finals during his sophomore, junior, and senior years, winning the title during his junior year. At this stage of basketball's evolution, games were very slow and low scoring. The rules dictated that a player had to dribble with 2 hands when progressing down the court, and there was a center court tip-off after every point was scored. For instance, in the state final his junior year, the score was 27-23, and his senior year a heartbreaking 13-12 loss with Wooden missing a game-winning shot. This slow-paced style of game didn't really seem to matter to the crowds. Indiana at this time was right in the thick of the explosion in popularity of the game. Nestled in the heart of the Midwest, the Hoosier State was and still is known for its fanatical supporters. In fact, the game of basketball bordered on religion. Indeed, Martinsville High School had a gym that seated over 5,000 that was sold out for every game, which was, if you remember, more than the population of the whole town. When it came for the state finals, an arena of over 18,000 was full. Wooden seemed to do his very best to innovate and break free of that slow-paced mold. He was short, at 5'10", and so made up for his lack of height by sprinting around the court, throwing his body at the ball, and being an extremely consistent shooter. His exploits in high school attracted the attention of pretty much every Big Ten school in the Midwest, including powerhouses like Michigan and Indiana. However, Wooden decided to attend Purdue University in Indiana due to their civil engineering program. To him, a degree was the most important thing. At Purdue, he quickly morphed into a generational player, eventually comparable to the Wilt Chamberlains, Bill Russells, Jordans, or LeBrons. Indiana native and football legend Tom Harmon would say, he was the king, the idol of any kid with a basketball. In Indiana, that was every kid. At Purdue, he became the first 3-time All-American, and although there was no national tournament at the time, during his senior year when he was named Player of the Year, in 1932, he led Purdue to an incredible season in which they were retroactively named national champions. I thought it was important to detail some of Wooden's playing ability. Most people know of his exploits as a coach, but he was pretty much as good a player as a coach. He was actually truly world class. After graduating, he went on to teach English and coach high schools in both Indiana and Kentucky, and he also played a few seasons as a professional in the NBL. During one season, he made 134 consecutive free throws, which is still the record for any professional basketball league in the world. For reference, the NBA's highest is 97. In 1942, he quit his job and joined the US Navy, becoming a trainer or physical fitness trainer for people being sent overseas. And quoting from his own website, a ruptured appendix keeps him from his first assignment on board the USS Franklin, an Essex-class aircraft carrier. Soon thereafter, his replacement is killed during a kamikaze attack on the Franklin in the Pacific. Upon return from service, Wooden returned briefly to coaching at the high school level before he found his calling in coaching college basketball. He finished his high school coaching career with a record of 218 wins and 42 losses, or an 83.8% winning record. So firstly, for college, he coached for 2 seasons at Indiana State Teachers College before moving on to UCLA. Those 2 seasons in Indiana and his decision to leave high school coaching kind of give a few more clues into the principles that guided Wooden. Quoting from author John Matthew Smith in his book The Sons of Westwood, which was one of the primary sources of my research, other coaches who had served in the war were not offered their old jobs. He, Wooden, strongly believed that veterans deserved their old coaching jobs, and when they were not rehired, he decided to leave. Wooden found his way to Indiana State, and when his team won the conference in 1947, they were invited to the now-established national tournament. However, he turned the invitation down, at the time explaining that his players were falling behind on schoolwork and needing to study. Later, the truth would become a little more clear. Wooden was disgusted by the segregation still present that would stop one of his players, who really played actually, from even traveling to the tournament. He turned down the invitation on the principle that every person is an equal. Well, today, Wooden's stance seems like a pretty obvious thing to do, but in the 1940s, it was really nothing short of heretical. When Wooden began playing in the 1920s, whites and blacks did not play together. Doing so would have risked the notion of social order, and hinted that perhaps everyone was equal after all. What's more, Wooden was from rural Indiana. Very few black people were around. Nevertheless, his stance was firm, and the next season the national tournament organizers relented, and Indiana State traveled. They made it all the way to the final and lost. And remarkably, this is the only final a Wooden team ever lost. Another couple of stories give a glimpse into Wooden's character. Purdue wanted him to return as an assistant in order to prep him for the head coaching position, but he wouldn't out of respect for the coach, theorizing that his presence around the coach and program could lead to an awkward situation regarding who the real leader was. Finally, when Wooden was being pursued by both the University of Minnesota and UCLA, he had his mind and heart set on staying in the Midwest with Minnesota. Wooden is quoted later saying, "I had hoped to take the job at the University of Minnesota, but a snowstorm knocked out telephone lines there, and they didn't call back at 6 p.m. as they had promised. UCLA called about 15 minutes later and offered the job. Wooden accepted the offer, thinking the Golden Gophers had lost interest. Later that night, when Minnesota officials finally did get through to the Wooden household, John wouldn't go back on his word, and the family packed its bags for Los Angeles." I think these few anecdotes are great examples of some of the principles that Wooden followed, treating everyone the same, not wanting to show disrespect, and holding true to his word. In many ways, these are traditional, old-school values that many of us would accept as being the right thing for Wooden to do. How admirable and principled of him we might think. But in reality, if we were in his shoes, those are gut-wrenching decisions when weighing the benefits and the costs of each of those decisions. To go to the national tournament for the first time or stay home. To have a terrific job opportunity at Purdue or pray and hope something else materialized. And to go to Minnesota and stay in the Midwest or embrace the unknown in California with a far lower wage. It is a beautiful thing to see how Wooden believed in doing the right thing based on his beliefs. And now that we have meandered our way to UCLA, we're going to begin to explore just how Wooden's core beliefs led to so much success. So, basketball as a varsity sport at UCLA began in 1919 when Fred Cousins became both the football and basketball coach. He would finish 2 seasons later with a 21-4 record. The program was off to a great start, but the next 2 coaches wouldn't be as successful. In fact, from 1928 until Wooden was hired in 1948, there were only 3 winning seasons. During this period, there was also a 39-match losing streak to bitter crosstown rivals USC. There were some glimmers of hope, though. In 1940, Jackie Robinson, yes, the famous first African-American to play Major League Baseball, turned out for the varsity basketball team for the first time. He led the conference that season in scoring and the next. At the same time, he was also winning the NCAA championship in long jump, leading UCLA to their first undefeated season in football, and of course playing baseball for the Bruins too. Nevertheless, UCLA basketball had a culture of losing. Wooden's task was uphill from the very beginning. John Matthew Smith describes the bleak situation. All 5 of the starting players from the previous season were gone, including All-American Don Barksdale. When he evaluated the team's equipment, Wooden discovered lopsided basketballs that did not bounce, worn-out sneakers, and frayed uniforms. As I said, uphill from the very beginning. To make matters worse, the third-floor gym where they practiced and played was also shared with the wrestling and cheerleading teams, and would come to be affectionately known as the B.O. Barn, thanks to the poor ventilation and lack of showering facilities. Perhaps more shocking for Wooden was the 2,000 seat limit of the arena, less than half the size of his high school back in Martinsville. Incredibly, a new arena would not be built for another 17 years. One last damning detail that I have to mention is Wooden's part-time job working at a local dairy farm. His UCLA wage simply did not pay enough. Despite all of these obstacles in the way, Wooden charged on, determined to leave his mark on the players fortunate enough to learn under him. To begin, Wooden had two main objectives: teach the proper fundamentals of the game and improve the team's conditioning. However, before the players even stepped onto the court, Wooden sat them down in the locker room. He did this every season. He made them take off their shoes and socks and carefully demonstrated exactly how to slide on the socks so there were no wrinkles. Wrinkles were bad. They would eventually lead to blisters and worse performance. Then he taught them how to tie their shoe properly. Only then were the players ready to begin practicing. Wooden never believed in running laps of the court or running upstairs for conditioning. Instead, he demanded that every drill was done with the utmost intensity with little to no rest. A local reporter said Wooden was a remorseless slave driver in practice, keeping his protégés constantly on the move up and down the floor. Indeed, most players would say after their UCLA career that the practices Wooden ran were so hard that actual games were relaxed and easy in comparison. Teaching the fundamentals was also done with high intensity. Simple techniques like passing the ball at chest height, moving the feet, and keeping the hands up when defending were taught alongside commands of, "You're too slow, hustle," and one of Wooden's favorite sayings, "Be quick, but don't hurry." The intensity on the court was matched or perhaps even surpassed by Wooden's own obsession of optimizing the 2-hour practices. Each morning, Wooden and his assistants would meet for 2 hours to plan the afternoon practice to the exact minute. Smith writes, "During these planning sessions, Wooden instructed his secretary that he wanted no interruptions, no phone calls, or visitors. Preparing for practice was the most important part of the day." As soon as the basic fundamentals and conditioning levels were to an okay standard for Wooden, he introduced a completely new way of playing the game on the West Coast, the fast break offense. Wooden realized quickly that the teams he would be playing against would have no idea how to defend this new style of basketball, focused around speed and turning the ball over. He knew innately how to properly play the style, being one of the early adopters from his days at Martinsville High School. Indeed, when Wooden would grow frustrated with his players not implementing the new style to his lofty standards, in practice he would often jump in and show them exactly how to play this style. Well, to everyone's surprise, it worked. That first season, UCLA won a program record 22 games on the way to claiming the PCC's Southern Division, which is their conference. The next year, they won the division again and went on to win the PCC championship, punching a ticket to the NCAA tournament for the first time in school history. Although the Bruins would lose in the first round, they finished 7th in the overall national rankings that season. Wooden, it seemed, was a godsend who had turned around the fortunes of the program. In the summer after his second season, though, Wooden had had enough of West Coast life and was ready to return to the Midwest. Rumors swirled in the LA press that Purdue, Notre Dame, and Minnesota were ready to offer Wooden a tempting deal. In anticipation, Wooden prepared to quit. He informed the athletic director and the student manager of the Associated Students of UCLA that he wanted to be released from the final year of his contract. Why, you might ask, is he informing a student of this decision? Well, that would be because that student manager was technically his boss. Wooden's checks came from him each month, not the athletic department. Incredibly, Wooden was reporting to a student. Even more incredibly, this practice would continue until 1960, 12 years after Wooden had joined. After the meeting, Wooden did not receive permission to leave. Maybe the student was giving it the big time. But he became determined to leave after his contract had finished the next season. But when that time came, none of the Big Ten schools called, so Wooden signed another contract, and the UCLA dynasty was ready to begin. Although, for another 12 years until the 1964 season, that dynasty wasn't really evident. Sure, Wooden and UCLA continued to have great success in their conference, never finishing below third, but they couldn't emulate that success on the national stage. Their best finish was in the 1962 season, when they came fourth. Other than that, they never made it out of the first couple rounds in that Western region. So, we're going to begin by fast-forwarding now to that 1964 season to begin talking about the incredible success. So, to recap, UCLA won 10 championships in 12 years, but we're just going to cover the first 5. Wooden was an old-school coach. He didn't recruit much until his later years at UCLA, but instead relied on the abundance of talent in LA and Southern California. So in 1960, when 6'2" high school star Walt Hazzard was named Philadelphia High School Player of the Year, Wooden had no idea who he was. Every coach on the East Coast wanted Hazzard to join their program, and he was heavily recruited. But instead, he chose to escape to LA on the advice of one of Wooden's stars now playing professionally who had happened to see him score 36 points in a game. Hazzard was inspired by the Black Stars like Jackie Robinson, who had had so much success out west. There was also a prevailing narrative that UCLA was a safe haven for African Americans, somewhere they could be treated as equals. While that was wrong, that narrative did help attract countless black players to UCLA. Smith states, Hazzard represented the key link in UCLA's athletic history. He was inspired by UCLA's black heroes of the past and paved the path for UCLA's black stars of the future. More than anyone else, Hazzard transformed UCLA into a championship basketball program. Hazzard wasn't built in the typical mold of a Wooden player. Instead of a disciplined, team-first, authority-abiding player, Hazzard was a flashy, exciting, and creative star who Wooden struggled with at first. Well, Hazzard's teammates perhaps struggled even more. He was a great exponent of the no-look pass, often driving to the hoop and flipping the ball at the last second to an open Bruin for an easy layup. Except those passes bordered on obscene in the West Coast game, and Hazzard's teammates simply couldn't comprehend. Oftentimes, the ball bounced off unsuspecting fingers, legs, and faces. One of his teammates, Larry Gower, put it like this: "He passed to a spot where you were supposed to be, not where you were. He made you think differently." Eventually, over the course of Hazzard's sophomore and junior years, well, not his freshman year because the rule was still that freshmen could not play varsity until 1972 when that was changed. So over the course of those sophomore and junior years, his teammates eventually learned his style. Wooden adapted his opinions around showmanship and individualism, and perhaps most importantly, Walt himself learned the importance of discipline and cooperation. Wooden made an important discovery during Hazzard's junior year. If he could make Walt angry during a timeout or break in play, that emotion would evolve as soon as he stepped back onto the court into a focus he didn't usually possess. Wooden would strategically use that technique at crucial times in games, intentionally shouting and screaming at Hazzard in full earshot of his teammates in order to enrage him to play better. Also during Hazzard's junior year, sophomore Gail Goodrich joined the team. The next season, Hazzard and Goodrich would form a powerful duo on their way to their first championship. Goodrich had led the freshman team in scoring in 1962 and expected to start or at least get a large amount of playing time in 63. But it was not meant to be. Like Hazzard, Wooden needed to mold him into a UCLA player. He was too individualistic and shot too much. Wooden soon realized that the same method that motivated Hazzard did the exact opposite to Goodrich. So, he began to offer him more support and less criticism, but still limited his playing time. That 1963 season ended with what the Los Angeles Times reported was the most thorough beating ever administered against a John Wooden coached team. a 93-79 beating by Arizona State. But, as all bad failures offer, great learnings were gleaned. Wooden and his top assistant Jerry Norman reflected on the season, especially that last loss. And Norman began to work his magic. While he was the coach of the freshman team at UCLA, he had employed the unusual tactic of the full-court zone press on the way to a 94-22 record. Usually we see the full-court press today at the end of games when one team is desperately trying to draw level or get ahead. But Norman proposed that the varsity team in 1964 employ it throughout the whole game, with a slight twist in that UCLA players would be in zones rather than matched up man-to-man. Initially, Wooden dismissed his idea. Smith writes, Norman persisted, convincing Wooden to spend more time coaching defense. Finally, Wooden agreed to install the zone press. It was one of the best decisions he ever made. To begin the triumphant 1964 campaign, UCLA laid waste to the Brigham Young Cougars, setting a school record with a 113-71 victory. The BYU players couldn't deal with the constant pressure and fast-paced offense with Hazard and Goodrich pulling the strings. The season marched on and UCLA just kept winning. Early on in the season, they faced off against the Big Ten's best team in the Michigan Wolverines, who were filled with domineering players, many who would go on to play in the NBA. But they couldn't keep up. Despite the Bruins having no player over 6'5", they ran away as 98-80 victors and were suddenly ranked first in the country. No one could figure out how to beat the press. Teams could stay close for some period of time. Some teams lasted until late into the second half. But eventually, the constant pressure and superior conditioning of the Bruins would lead to outsized runs where UCLA would build an unassailable lead. As it said at the time, somehow, sometime, we know our pressure will get to them. As the season progressed, the Bruins found themselves finishing the regular season at 26-0. In the 1964 NCAA tournament, there were 25 teams. So, being the number 1 seed, they received a bye for the first round. There were only 4 games between them and glory, and all 4 were great battles. They beat Seattle by 5 points in the second round, and San Francisco by only 4. The Tractors and the media blared that the wheels had fallen off. Next they played Kansas State in the semifinal, a team they had only beaten by 3 points in December. And with just over 7 minutes to go, it looked like the Wildcats would get the better of them. They were leading by 5. But the Bruins came storming back. Hazard took control of the game and they ran out winners 90-84. Suddenly they were 29-0 and in the final for the first time in school history. On March the 21st, the Duke Blue Devils stood opposite the Bruins as favorites, and looked good for it too. Duke handled the press well and played through it, leading 30-27 at halftime. Wooden decided to substitute quiet Kenny Washington into the game, whose performance was anything but quiet. Playing against the segregated Duke team, Washington, who had learned to keep his head down and avoid eye contact with white people, took it to them. He finished with a career-best 26 points, just behind Goodrich's 27. In the highest-scoring championship game in history, UCLA emerged victors over yet another team who had succumbed to the never-ending pressure. Smith writes, for Hazard and Washington, 2 young blacks who lived with the scars of segregation, beating Duke was especially rewarding. For them, this win was a small triumph over racial bigotry. Afterwards, Goodrich turned to assistant Norman, who orchestrated that press, and told him, Jerry will be back in the same spot next year. The 1965 season started the worst way possible, with a crushing loss to Illinois, 110-83. Sports writers and media crucified UCLA. Without Hazard, who had graduated, they expected the Bruins to fall back to their lowly ways. But it wasn't just Hazard who was lost. 2 other starting seniors in Jack Hirsch and Fred Slaughter had also graduated. Wooden debated whether this crop of players was capable of playing a full-court zone press without Hazard pulling the strings on offense. And he actually preemptively changed the zone press from a 2-2-1 to a 1-2-1-1 lineup during preseason. After losing their first game, Goodrich and the Bruins bounced back well. Legendary coach Henry Iber saw the Bruins that season and remarked, "My goodness, I believe they're faster than last year." The season progressed well again, with the Bruins only losing once more before making it to the NCAA tournament. A massive part of their success was due to senior Keith Erickson, a player Wooden would later proclaim as the best athlete he ever coached. Erickson had also by this time already played volleyball in the Olympics for the US and was at UCLA on a combined basketball and baseball scholarship. Erickson was known as Mr. Defense. The Minnesota coach lamented that UCLA could press so aggressively and let you break through now and then because Erickson's going to block your shot anyhow. The Utah coach put it like this when he saw shot after shot slapped away by Erickson. A play like that destroys you physically, mentally, and morally. So with Erickson and Goodrich dominating at respective baskets, they felt confident moving into tournament time. They brushed aside BYU, San Francisco, and Wichita State in the semifinal, setting up a showdown against number 1 Michigan, the perfect ending to the season for the neutral. Once again, they found themselves losing in the first half, and once again, Wooden asked Kenny Washington to go in and up the tempo. It worked. The Bruins proceeded to go on an 11-2 and 15-3 run to lead by 47-34 at halftime. Like Hazard had done in so many games the season prior, Goodrich now took charge of the game, dictating the offense and flow. He scored 27 in the second half, finishing with an incredible 42 total points, still the second most ever in an NCAA championship game. They had become the 5th ever team to win back-to-back titles, and their success came at just the right time in history to lure one of the greatest basketball players ever to Westwood. At 7'2", Lew Alcindor was the most dominant high school player in the country. Every single coach wanted him. In 1965, the national media had already been covering his talent for over 2 years, since he was 15, and they reported he had received over 100 scholarship offers, including some from still segregated programs in the South, who must have decided that Alcindor was worth breaking racial lines for. Coaches assumed if he joined their program, they were almost guaranteed 3 national championships. Even President Lyndon Johnson sent him a letter imploring him to commit to Houston in order to help break the color divide. Now, as mentioned previously, Wooden didn't really recruit. He left that up to his assistant Norman. But for Alcindor, he made a huge exception. In New York City, on the other side of the country, Wooden and Norman met with Alcindor's parents in their apartment at 1 a.m. to talk about academics, faith, and discipline, not just basketball like most other coaches had done. His mother, Cora, immediately felt like UCLA was the right place for her son. According to her, Wooden behaved more like a minister than a coach. When Alcindor visited campus, he saw the construction of the new basketball arena, Pauley Pavilion. The combination of the investment in the program, the back-to-back national championships, Wooden's interest in him as a person, and most importantly, the perception that UCLA was a safe haven for black athletes, in Alcindor's mind was almost made up for him. On his signing day in front of several hundred people, he began by stating, "I've always been captivated by California." In 1966, when he arrived, freshmen were still barred from playing on the varsity team. Alcindor quickly found that UCLA wasn't the racial paradise he had been led to believe. He wrote in a Sports Illustrated article that he dug deep down into my black studies and my religious studies. I withdrew into myself to find myself. I made no further attempts to integrate. I was consumed and obsessed by my interest in the black man, in black power, black pride, black courage. He began reading Malcolm X, studying the literature around the civil rights movement, and later learning about Islam. While tectonic shifts were happening off the court, on the court, Alcindor was more dominant than ever. To begin the 1955-66 season, the varsity team played a scrimmage against the freshman team, as they did every season. That freshman team that Alcindor was on also included 3 other high school All-Americans. Ken Heights and Lynn Shackelford of Southern California were 2 superb shooters, and Lucius Allen was a rapid guard who had received over 75 college offers from Kansas City. After 40 minutes, although UCLA were the reigning varsity champions, they were only the second best team on campus. Alcindor had 31 points, 21 rebounds, and 7 blocks on the way to a 75-60 win. That season, the freshman team went on to a 21-0 season, but the varsity comparatively struggled, finishing 18-8 and not playing in the NCAA Championships. So, Wooden was looking forward to the 1966-67 season, and he made the bold decision to start 4 sophomores in Alcindor, Allen, Shackelford, and Heights, alongside junior captain Mike Warren. His game plan was pretty simple: pass the ball to Alcindor. If the defense collapsed in on him, he would flip it to an open teammate who would have an open shot. And remember, those teammates were some of the best shooters in the country. They would have been stars on any other team. The opening game of the season, Alcindor had 56 points and 21 rebounds in front of nearly 13,000 fans. Coaches all over the country were terrified. After watching one game, they scrambled to find a way to stop him, but no one properly figured it out. Actually, no one really ever properly figured it out. One tactic employed by USC was stall ball. Before the shot clock had been invented, USC players simply hung onto the ball for minutes at a time, trying to slow the pace of the game and keep the score close. This tactic led to a tedious game where UCLA eventually won 40-35 later in the season. While coaches scrambled for a solution, the media kept complaining. The LA Times reported that Alcindor was capable of either destroying or making a farce out of the collegiate game. Rule changes were suggested. Fans held signs asking for him to be banned. None of this mattered to Wooden and Alcindor though. They rolled on through a 26-0 regular season, and they easily disposed Wyoming and Pacific to set up an exciting semifinal against Houston, who, according to many, was the best team in the country. Although Houston took a 19-18 lead, the game was pretty much soon over, and in the end, it was a comfortable 73-58 win, setting up a final against the Dayton Flyers. After the game, Dayton head coach remarked, "Alcindor, as good as he is, made victory so routine and easy that excitement vanished seconds after the start." Indeed, within the first few minutes, the scoreboard read 20-4 in favor of the Bruins, and the final was a dominant 79-64, giving Wooden his 3rd and Alcindor his 1st championship. 3 days after UCLA won, the NCAA banned the dunk, seemingly in direct response to Alcindor's dominance. For him, it was like a slap in the face. There was no better dunker in the game. In the off-season and in the lead-up to the 1967-68 season, he was initially frustrated. But Wooden helped him to reframe the rule change into a positive. Instead of dunking, Alcindor developed his unstoppable and almost trademark skyhook. He would cup the ball with one hand, extend his arm beyond reach of any player, and softly flip the ball into the basket. Alcindor's skyhook is widely regarded as the only undefendable shot in NBA history. In fact, less than 10 players have ever blocked it. And on the back of this technique, he became the highest NBA point scorer, only surpassed by LeBron in 2023. As they get up for another season, Wooden was a little flummoxed. The whole starting lineup from the previous year returned, along with some other key pieces. While watching preseason practice, Wooden admitted there's just not that much to teach. The season began superbly, winning 13 in a row before traveling to play Houston. This game wasn't just another regular season game. The Cougars were ranked number 2 in the country, and they hired out the Houston Astrodome for the game, which was the home of MLB, NFL, and NBA teams. The game was billed as the biggest show in sports, and the game of the century. It was the first regular season college basketball game to be shown on TV nationwide during primetime. Over 50,000 tickets were sold, more than doubling the previous college basketball record, and a reported 20 million viewers watched as the inexplicable happened. UCLA's 47-match winning streak was snapped. 8 days earlier, Alcindor's eye had been accidentally poked while contesting a rebound. Wooden said it looked as though somebody had rubbed a piece of sandpaper across his eye. He hadn't practiced in a week, spending 3 of those days in a dark room, and was still suffering the morning of the game from blurred vision. Nevertheless, Wooden made the odd decision to keep him in for all 40 minutes despite his below-par performance. In the end, it was a close 71-69 loss, with the Bruins making a key mistake in the last few seconds to tie the game. The game of the century ushered in a new era for college basketball, and mainstream stations like NBC, ABC, and CBS finally began to take notice. From this game, the concept of March Madness directly stemmed. The season continued pretty strongly for the Bruins after the Houston loss, winning the next 12 regular season games and sweeping through the first rounds of the NCAA tournament to set up a tantalizing rematch against Houston in the semis. This time, Alcindor was fit. UCLA were hell-bent on delivering justice and restoring their number 1 ranking, and importantly, the game was played at a neutral venue, but this venue was in Los Angeles, so the Bruins effectively had a home crowd. The Cougars couldn't cope. By halftime, UCLA led 53-31, and in the second half, Lucius Allen ran the show with 19 points, 12 assists, and 9 rebounds. Next came North Carolina the next day. Although the score wasn't as blown out as the day before, there was never any doubt. Alcindor controlled the game superbly and executed his skyhook to near perfection. The Bruins had become the first side to win back-to-back championships twice, but thoughts immediately turned to the next season. Could Wooden do the unthinkable and lead the Bruins to 3 in a row? During that summer of 1968, Lew Alcindor was renamed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. His Islamic mentor explained Kareem meant noble and generous, Abdul was servant, and Jabbar powerful. But Abdul-Jabbar mostly kept this to himself, not wanting to draw media scrutiny like he had seen Cassius Clay come under after he became Muhammad Ali. When it came to the 1968-69 season, Wooden had a few replacements to make. 3 of his players graduated and were drafted to the NBA, and longtime assistant Jerry Norman decided to leave. Norman had pushed Wooden to take recruiting more seriously, often taking it upon himself to travel far and wide to see prospects in person. He was also the driving force behind the zone press. According to the Los Angeles Times, Norman was as much an architect of UCLA's early success as Wooden himself. Despite the changes, the Bruins continued on without skipping a beat, winning 25 consecutive regular season games. In the final game before the tournament, though, Alcindor lost his second and last game as a Bruin. USC had played UCLA the night before and taken them to double overtime before finally losing. The next evening, they decided to employ their old sneaky tactic, stall ball. They would hold on to the ball for minutes at a time in order to slow the tempo and keep the score close. And this time it worked. They ran out 46-44 winners. Despite the loss, UCLA cruised to the NCAA semifinals where they faced off against massive underdogs, the Drake Bulldogs. It was close, way too close for Wooden's liking. With 1:23 remaining in the second half and a 9-point lead, UCLA thought they were in the clear. Until point guard John Vallely, who was having his best ever game for the Bruins, fouled out. Wooden turned to senior Bill Sweek, who meandered over to sub in. Wooden snapped at him to hurry, but Sweek fired back. Incredibly, in front of over 18,000 fans, the player and coach began arguing, until Sweek, incensed, turned around and stormed into the locker room. Shocked, Wooden turned to a sophomore who had barely played. With 7 seconds to play, the lead had been cut to just 1 point. UCLA hit 2 free throws at the buzzer to squeak into the championship game 85-82. Afterwards, Wooden stormed into the shower room in full suit with his fist cocked, ready to carry on the argument. It didn't come to blows, but Sweek verbalized what many players had been feeling. The starters on the team were treated differently to those who didn't play. The double standards were unfair, and he was angry that Wooden couldn't see the problem he had created. The next morning, they shook hands and apologized, and after that, all was well and they both moved past it. In the final, Wooden faced off against his alma mater, Purdue. They were too strong, too powerful, and Abdul-Jabbar was the difference. He finished with 37 points and 20 rebounds in his final college game. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner headline screamed, "Lew CLA, 3 in a row. Purdue blasted, 92-72. Big A, yes, 37. Kareem finished his college career with an 88-2 record, 3 national championships, and 3 tournament Most Outstanding Player awards, alongside ushering in a new era of commercialism for the sport. He also had a small hand in the civil rights movement at a time when few athletes spoke out. So that actually ends our tale for today. That's 5 championships right there. Remember to come back for part 2 to hear about the next 5. And I'm not going to run a full analysis on this episode. I want to save that for the next one. But we did spend a good chunk of time on Wooden and his story today, so I want to pull out a few favorite quotes or ideas of his that specifically apply to his coaching methods. One idea that I love is his 8 laws of learning, which are explanation, demonstration, imitation, correction, repetition, 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 and repetition. You can just imagine Wooden himself on the court at UCLA explaining the fundamentals, demonstrating them, then having his players imitate him. Then every practice henceforth demanding constant repetition, all the while making small corrections to ensure whatever they were practicing was as close to perfect as possible. Another idea that Wooden followed was that of the practice as a journey and the game, the end result. In a TED Talk he gave, Wooden said this, "As a basketball coach at UCLA, I liked our practices to be the journey, and the game would be the end result. I liked to go up and sit in the stands and watch the players play, and see whether I'd done a decent job during the week." Indeed, during most games, Wooden coached very little. To keep himself occupied, he spent time yelling at the officials. This practice as the journey concept was also why during practice Wooden ran his players so hard. So when it came time to the game, it was almost like a reward for the players. Finally, and related to that idea, is this Wooden quote from the same TED Talk. "The score of the game is a byproduct of effort. Results will be what they should be, not what you want them to be." So there we go. The first episode of the UCLA Bruins is done. A slightly abbreviated finish, but I do want to save that heavy analysis for the next episode. So thanks for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Please comment or message me. Subscribe if you like what you heard, and see you on the next episode. Thanks.